hope that throughout the day, there'll be an opportunity to reflect on the significance of our relationships with land and law. And ideally, we will be inspired to do so with the grace and humility that Peter brought to his own work and interactions. Before we begin, my co-chairs, Professor Jamie Cameron and Justice Patrick Monahan, and I would like to express our gratitude to everyone who had a hand in pulling this event together. Amongst many important and worthy folks, let me extend special thanks to David Hogg for his support, to Adam Dodak for his enthusiastic championing of this idea, to all our speakers today and our panel chairs, to the excellent folks at Osgoode PD, and last but not least, the wonderful Erica Robinson, who works for Osgoode and dealt with the administrative aspects of today. So if anything's going right, we know who to thank. As with any good project, today would not have been possible without all of these people and many, many more. So let me now thank Osgoode's current dean, worthy inheritor of at least part of Peter's brilliant legacy, Trevor Farrow, for his consistent attention to this project, and invite him up to say a few words.
Thank you, Professor Lawrence. Shall I stick with the handheld mic? Is that okay? Okay, try not to wreck the place. So welcome everyone to the Chief Justice of Ontario. We've got current and former judges from across the country, courts across the country, including the Supreme Court of Canada. Maybe I'm just going to step out in front of this so I can see the people around the space. We've got several former deans, at least one current dean for now, numerous Osgoode staff, students, colleagues, alumni, many friends and colleagues of Peter from all aspects of the community and all aspects of his life. And also to members of his family. I want to honor his children in particular, David and Anne. My task this morning is to briefly, and I was really told it probably doesn't really matter what I talk about as long as I'm brief, but in particular, Peter's significant influence, not only in Canada, but abroad. And I thought about that quite long, in fact, when I was preparing for today. And there's a number of ways to think about this. And given the people in the room who knew him so well, given how many people are going to speak about different aspects of this, I can be brief. And I'm going to come at this from a couple of different perspectives. By way of background, Peter, as I think probably all of you knew, came to Osgoode in 1970. Was supposed to be for a year from Monash, and thankfully stayed for, I think, 34 at least at Osgoode. 29 as a faculty member, 5 as dean, and then on to Blake's. And as the story goes, you guys all know how it went, and we'll hear more about it today. But speaking of 1970, does anyone know what the top song on the 100 Billboard was that year? Any guesses? It wasn't American Woman, which was number 3. He did meet a woman in America, but that's not what it was. Love Story was the top movie. Bridge Over Troubled Water, for all of you who are afraid to speak in the room. I know you're so shy, all of you. Anyway, in terms of Peter's influence, hard to know exactly how to speak about that, but if we think about it from, for example, if we reduced him to statistics, the most cited, and we'll hear more about this, Canadian legal academic, the Supreme Court of Canada. Massive impact, not just on how the court understands and understood constitutional law, but how the law has developed in this country. As a scholar, Dean Gerald Ledane asked Peter to teach constitutional law. And of course, he wasn't a Canadian at all, but quickly developed materials in order to teach that course, which became the leading book. As many of people said, he literally wrote the book. But not only that book, Constitutional Law in Canada, which has multiple editions, but other treatises and massively influential legal scholarship in tax and administrative law, crown immunity, and what have you. As a professor, when you go back and look at what some of his students have said, they described him as a beloved but humble, amazing prof, No one ever made me, never ever made me feel stupid. Annually, the best professor. He was apparently given a standing ovation at every convocation after his dean's address. Haven't gotten that yet. As a colleague, they are quoted as saying that they adored him. Best colleague, developed an important vision for Osgoode missions for the future and brought us together. And he was described by a number of staff members as a great person and an inspiration to work with. As a dean, we're thinking about different aspects of his influence. He made a major contribution to Osgoode and to others, other spots in the Canadian community, obviously as a professor. Then his 5 years as dean of this institution from 1998 to 2003, leading the school through many, many important innovations. Some have described him as Osgoode's best dean. Well, I think that might be fake news. Actually in 1999 in the Osgoode Continuum magazine, he was quoted as saying a number of things, included he even enjoyed his first year as dean, and I totally don't believe that. And then as a scholar in residence, many people have that wonderful career, and that would be enough for most of us, if not everyone. He then went on to a whole other career at the great firm of Blakes. Many of his former colleagues and friends are here. And he was not only a huge inspiration and influence on the major developments and impact that firm had through its work, but also, as I understand it, on junior colleagues, junior associates, students. He was a person for all, which I think everyone in my research can confirm. And then as counsel, as many of you know, Peter also did a huge amount of work for numbers of organizations. He was counsel to federal governments, provincial governments, governors general, First Nations, many others. And according to a 2015 OBA article, where they were looking at some of what he was most proud of, one of his most famous and apparently his proudest professional achievement was, of course, his work with the same-sex marriage case in 2004. And he reportedly recalled being invited after the reference to the Metropolitan Community Church in Toronto, just over in Riverdale, that was a leading voice and at the forefront of the same-sex marriage movement. And he recalled the joy that he received from working with not only the excellent lawyers, but I think this is important, but most of all from the many Canadians whose lives he touched. And according to Peter, what he said was, I think the sum of human happiness was increased by that decision. And that's good. I felt very, very proud that I played a small role in achieving that. It's wonderful. For all of this, Peter was honored, and we could think about his impact from all of the honors, being appointed a Queen's Counsel, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, made an officer, and then a Companion of the Order of Canada, and on and on. But perhaps most important, we take it all back to family. And what Peter again said in that 2015 article, that Peter was perhaps the most important aspects of his influence and his life were his happy marriage, good health, and the pride he felt in his children and the parts of his life for which he was most grateful. So overall, I think anyone could say that the impact of Peter Hogg can be counted on any numbers of calculus and from perspectives, and in each one of them, it's quite incredible, and I think deserves the title of this conference, which of course at the top of my notes is A Brilliant Legacy. But finally, before I sit down, why take my word for it? Who better to ask about Peter Hogg than one of his former students, and not only any former student, but the Chief Justice of Ontario. So it's at this moment that I would like to welcome Chief Justice Tulloch. And Justice Tulloch is known to, I think, everyone in the room. He first became a Superior Court judge in 2003. You don't get to come up yet. I don't get to do that very often. So an appellate court judge in 2012 and appointed Chief Justice of this province in 2022. So not only the first black appellate judge in this country, but the first Black Chief Justice in the country. There are so many things that we could say about Chief Justice Tulloch, but as Dean of Osgoode, I can't help but focus on our connections. And some of the things that Osgoode is so proud of is the Black Law Students Association bestowed the inaugural Lincoln Alexander Award on Chief Justice Tulloch back in 2013. And then 10 years later, our colleague Mary Jane Mossman did a lovely citation as Chief Justice Tulloch was awarded an honorary degree at York last spring. So Chief Justice, it's terrific to welcome you back. Now you can come up, please.
Great. Thank you, Dean Farrell, and thanks to all the organizers for this incredible conference. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to provide some opening remarks for this incredible and remarkable man who is beloved to all of us in this room. And certainly as a former Osgoode student, he was very influential on my life and certainly on the rest of my entire legal career. I'm pleased to speak to you from many vantage points with respect to Professor Hogg, not only as a Chief Justice of Ontario, but also as a judge who has presided over many constitutional matters at various levels of court, and also as both a Crown and defense counsel who has argued points of law based on Peter's authoritative and trustworthy insights. And not the least, very much not the least, as one of his students in my first year constitutional class at Osgoode Hall Law School. The program today is impressive for what will be discussed and for who will be taking part. And I'm sure that each of us will hear quite a bit about Peter Hogg, who in my view is a real Renaissance man, brilliant in so many ways. And all of that is true. He was a lot of things and good at so very many things. But he was first and foremost a great teacher. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great American essayist, philosopher, and lecturer, is quoted as saying, "The great teacher is not the man who supplies the most facts, but the one in whose presence we become different people." As a student, it was impossible to sit in any of Peter's classes and not be transfixed by his brilliance, his humility, and his ability to simplify complex areas of the law so that each and every one of us could understand. He was able to transform each and every one of us as students into his legal disciples. And I heard Trevor stated that when he was dean, everyone would stand and give him stand an ovation. And at the end of our class, we did exactly the same thing back in 1986. I can tell you this was true for me as well. In 1986, I began to study law at Osgoode Hall Law School. As many of you may know, at Osgoode, the first year class is divided into several sections. At the time, my section was Section E, and we were fortunate enough to be assigned Professor Peter Hogg to teach constitutional law. This was, of course, before he would go on to become dean of the law school. I was lucky to get Peter Hogg as a professor in my first year class. But after that, luck would have nothing to do with it. It was almost virtually impossible to get into one of his subsequent classes unless you made it your first choice. Osgoode students had to rank the courses that they wanted and the professors that they wanted for the course. If you wanted any course taught by Peter Hogg, you better give it your #1 ranking or you would never get in. He was that popular. It may seem odd that someone from Lower Hutt, New Zealand would become the top academic in Canadian constitutional law and help shape our understanding of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. However, Peter was able to master any topic to which he put his considerable mind, whether it be constitutional law, trust, or tax. And it's interesting because I took a number of tax courses with Neil Brooks, but I used Professor Hogg's notes. And the same with trust, right? It was Tim Uden that taught us trust back then. And I also used Professor Hogg's notes. So course notes from any course that he taught at Osgoode were always in high demand by other students. When asked a question during class, Peter would pause for a moment, look into the air, and then elucidate the clearest, most eloquent and concise answer. An answer that most lawyers would envy if they labored over it for hours before inserting it into a factum. And he did it with apparent ease. Peter answered every question carefully and reflectively. Every student was made to feel important. We felt that our opinions mattered to him. He treated us like colleagues, not students. Peter had simply worked his way up to the top from the floor and was sending the elevator back down so that others could join him. And all the while, he did it with a dry wit and the embodiment of decency. He simply exuded civility and decorum, a family man, and a true gentleman scholar. After I graduated from law school, I was fortunate enough to continue my relationship with Peter. Over the years, we would meet occasionally for lunch. By the way, the first time I ever went into the King Eddie was with Peter Hogg for lunch, where he often liked to lunch. I was again impressed with his charm, insight, and wit. Peter was a scholar and teacher, a prolific writer, and to me, a friend. The renowned Canadian physician, Sir William Ulster, once stated that no bubbles is so iridescent or floats longer than that blown by the successful teacher. As will be made very clear by today's conference, Peter sent off a lot of bubbles, and for that, he has our eternal gratitude. Thank you for this opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Chief Justice. And I assure you that my colleagues and I will not tell Neil Brooks and Tim Uden how you got through their courses. It's my very distinct honor to be able to chair this first panel. And in fact, let me say it's been a wonderful honor and privilege to be a member of the faculty at Osgoode Hall Law School for my career. And I could list many reasons for that, but one of the main reasons would be the great pleasure of being a lifelong colleague of Peter Hogg, a wonderful colleague and friend for so many decades. In this first panel titled Remembering Peter, a group of colleagues are going to speak about Peter and their relationship with him. It's quite an impressive panel, very honorable in every sense of the word panel. They are all honorable people. I will briefly introduce them and then call upon them in the order I will indicate. The first speaker is the Honorable Louise Arbour. She's well known to you for her remarkable career. You may not know she graduated from the Université de Montréal. In law, she then went to clerk for Justice Louis-Philippe Pigeon in the Supreme Court of Canada while doing some graduate work at Ottawa at the same time. She then worked for the Law Reform Commission in Ottawa. Some of you know I have an interest in restitutionary matters. Her first project was on restitution in the criminal law, and I look upon this as a great highlight of Louise's career. She then joined the faculty at Osgoode. She was, as best we can tell, the first female faculty member at Osgoode. How times have changed. It was a pioneering role, and she established an absolutely wonderful role model for the large numbers of female students who were at last coming to study law. She was a much cherished member of the faculty. I remember reading a student newspaper early on in her career. A student went on at enormous length about what a fabulous teacher Louise was and wonderful mentor and so on and so forth, and ended the article breathlessly with the comment, and on top of all that, she rolls her own cigarettes. Apparently, this was a very important sign of being cool in the early 1970s. You know much about her later career. She stayed at Osgoode for a long and wonderfully successful period of time as a faculty member. She was then appointed to the Superior Court of Justice in 1987, soon elevated to the Ontario Court of Appeal in 1990. In 1996, she became not just a national personality, but an international figure when she became the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, an extremely important contribution that she made. Amongst other things, launching the first prosecution against a sitting head of state, the Serbian president Slobodan Milosevic. Louise was then appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada by Prime Minister Graydon and served there for 5 years, then went on to, after retiring, on to other wonderful assignments as UN Commissioner, High Commissioner for Human Rights, and so on and so forth. Through her academic period, she was a very active member of the board of the CCLA, and we were all very thrilled when she came back to join our National Advisory Committee for the CCLA. The second speaker will be the Honorable James MacPherson. Jim is a maritimer. He grew up in Nova Scotia, went to Acadia, then Dalhousie for law, graduate work in law at Cambridge, then went into academic life, first at Victoria at the other end of the country, then Director of Constitutional Affairs at the University of Saskatchewan, then Executive Director of the Supreme Court of Canada as the Chief Assistant to the Supreme Court's Chief Justice, Brian Dixon. And then it was our good fortune to attract Jim to come to Osgoode as our Dean in 1988. He had a brilliant deanship. I won't go on about it, but let me mention one thing. Jim quickly figured out that 1989 would be the 100th anniversary of the founding of Osgoode Hall Law School in 1889, and he turned that into a wonderful opportunity to organize events of various kinds, including a centennial convocation at which we granted degrees to hundreds of former graduates of Osgoode Hall Law School who graduated at a time when no degrees were awarded, and they were awarded their LLBs from Osgoode, York. It was a great gesture to the graduating alumni. I remember Jim also invited Alan Blakeney, whom he'd gotten to know in Saskatchewan, to be a visiting professor. And I can tell you, having Alan Blakeney as a colleague was an absolutely wonderful experience. The third speaker, also honorable, is the Honorable Patrick Monahan. I'm sure you know of Patrick or know him well. He is the only member of the panel who actually graduated from Osgoode. He was a superstar student. He graduated with the gold medal. Unsurprisingly, went off to Harvard for graduate work, and we were thrilled to be able to attract him back to the full-time faculty in 1982. He had a distinguished academic career, wonderful teacher, lots of publications, including a book on constitutional law, following in Peter's footsteps. Also, the only member of the panel to have collaborated with Peter. Patrick became a co-editor of Peter's book on liability of the Crown in later editions. He was a wonderful leader of Osgoode. He actually went out and raised a ton of money. I think he was the first dean to have done so, and engineered a wonderful expansion and renovation of the facility at Osgoode that we enjoy today. In 2017, appointed to the Superior Court of Justice, and very recently elevated to the Court of Appeal for Ontario. He then became the third former Osgoode dean sitting on the Court of Appeal of Ontario. I mentioned this remarkable fact to my wife, Stephanie, and she said, well, that's interesting. Are there any former U of T colleagues or deans on the Court of Appeal? And I allowed myself to say, of course not. Fortunately, Robert Sharp had retired a few months before, and there were only Osgoode people there. Let me begin by calling upon Louise.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. In fact, my great ambition, sorry, I'm really worried Air Canada is going to cancel my flight, so I'm holding on to my phone. My great ambition is that my epitaph should read, "She was too short." And Patrick will be happy to hear that because he's got a huge text to share with you in a minute. I just want to, reflecting on what's been said so far, just set the record straight. I did roll my own cigarettes. And when I told that to my grandchildren recently, they were shocked. Not only that people smoked, I remember students complaining, this is after a few years of teaching, that they couldn't have a non-smoking room to write their exams. I thought, seriously, how unreasonable can you be? But I just want to set the record straight that it was actually tobacco that I was rolling. Although I've since now for at least a decade been very involved in the Global Commission on Drug Policy, advocating for drug policy reform. But in those days, I was still smoking tobacco. Still, I'm not smoking anything. I will be very brief because I just want to share just a few memories of my interaction with Peter. So he came to Osgoode, I now heard, in 1970. I came a few years later, and as you've heard, coming from Montreal, essentially, and at that point, having spent a little bit of time in Ontario, not a lot, I was enormously intimidating at the idea of teaching law at Osgoode Hall Law School. This was very overwhelming, but I took all my courage and I figured I'm sure I could do that. And then I arrived and I met a bunch of Australians, New Zealand. I couldn't understand a thing they said. And I vividly recalled my first conversation with Peter Hogg. I thought, oh my God, I'm not going to make it. And then I comforted myself. I figured, well, you know what? Maybe he won't make it. He just, maybe that's the way it's going to turn out. So I hope this is some encouragement to people who come with different backgrounds. The other thing I want to say, reflecting on what's been said so far, especially the reference to what was popular in the 70s, and I say that hoping that Harry Arthurs is not going to fall off his chair, but it's watching the movie Love Story that I heard for the first time about the Socratic method, which apparently was at Osgoode a religion. So let me just say a few things about my interactions with Peter. Even though causation takes many forms, I'm absolutely convinced that he was the original cause to the development of my career into the judiciary. I had never practiced law. I was teaching in those days criminal law and also evidence and criminal procedure. And after the charter came into effect, Peter came to me and said that he had been invited, I think by the Canadian Judicial Council, to put together a series of lectures for essentially for judges to sort of introduce this new adventure in constitutional law, in judicial review, essentially. And he asked me if I would take on all the criminal procedure, essentially the legal rights in the charter, all the criminal procedure, evidence, criminal law matters. And I really believe that it's because of this exposure that I got to many judges across the country, which then continued in my being involved in the Canadian Judicial Council summer seminars for federally appointed judges. I was always paired with Cal Tallis and Jean-Guy Boilard and so on, teaching recent developments in evidence. I believe that, but for this, I don't think I would ever have been considered for a judicial appointment, particularly on a trial bench, having never set foot in court before then. So I'm very conscious of that. And funny enough, I want to share with you, I'm sure you're going to hear today through many speakers, the evidence of Peter's brilliance and of his contributions, particularly through the development of Canadian jurisprudence. What I want to share with you is how much luck has to do with that. Not everything can be attributed. There are lots of people who have a lot of talents and the channels don't necessarily open to them for these talents to be demonstrated. Well, Peter came very close to that not happening to him, because when I was a law clerk in the Supreme Court of Canada for Justice Pigeon, as us, the then 9 law clerks were sitting in court, a lawyer cited someone, I don't know who it was, some academic, and the Chief Justice Fauteux interrupted and said, "Excuse me, counsel, this is completely inappropriate. Have you not heard of the living author rule?" Well, he hadn't, and neither of all of us. I think he was the only one who had never heard of it. And in fact, before I came in, I thought, I just wondered whether, am I dreaming? Did I make that up, or this really exists? Well, actually, it does exist. And I could refer you to an article called "Burying the Living, the Citation of Legal Writings in English Courts." It was published in 2010 in the American Journal of Comparative Law. Now, and history, because I heard it afterwards, said that I think Justice Ritchie at that point mumbled, "Well, for myself, I'll take help wherever I can find it." Well, have this rule, which apparently was based on the idea, or so is the way Justice Fauteux had explained it to the startling audience. No, he said, you cannot cite a living author because he, it was always he in those days, he may change his mind. Well, I thought, well, it's too bad that the dead ones can't change their minds, because a lot of them, frankly, might be a little more enlightened if they lived in the current world, but that's another story. Which is all to say that for all his talent, Peter's career might have taken a slightly different turn had the Supreme Court of Canada embraced the living author rule. When he asked me to do this teaching, these conferences on charter rights, I vividly recollect 2 interconnected issues that he and I discussed and that have stayed very present in my mind throughout my career. The first one was, well, and they're interrelated, the moratorium on equality rights, which was said to give legislatures, parliament, a chance to modify and adapt their laws. But the real genius, I think, of that moratorium was to give the judges an opportunity to flex their judicial muscles on issues that were more accessible to them. And what was that? Criminal law, criminal procedure, and evidence, because at common law, that was judge-made law. That's where it was already happening. It was a small step for judges to embrace the more daring striking down of legislation in an area in which they had essentially the monopoly on the preservation of fairness to the accused, the presumption of innocence, oaths, and so on. So in a sense, when 3 years later, equality rights arrived in the courts, the table had been set, oaths had been well, decided, what, 1986. In any event, I think the real genius of that delay, and Peter and I had a lot of conversations about that, about how the judges would react in a familiar environment, in a less familiar environment. So it was also, I think, to his credit and to the credit of the many, many judges who heard charter cases, having not had any kind of education, legal training in that kind of legal environment. And especially for Peter, I mean, the early cases were all in the field of criminal law and procedure. And he embraced that, which was not his main academic discipline. So when later on he became very famous for his theory of the dialogue between Parliament and the courts, came very close to there having been no dialogues between the courts and academics. But thankfully, it didn't turn out that way. So we ended up being the beneficiary of his wonderful legacy. Thank you.
Dean McCamus, Chief Justice Tulloch. I love saying that. How many people, when they're young, become law professors and 35 years later can look at a student and say Chief Justice in front of his name? So I'll say it again, Chief Justice Tulloch, and everybody else here gathered today to honor Peter. It's a real pleasure to be here. I look out at this audience and it's just filled with Osgoode people from over a half century. Osgoode people, 6 different categories. I was thinking about this last night. They're sitting here today are 6 different categories of Osgoode people. Category number 1, a university president, the absolutely wonderful Harry Arthurs. Category 2, 6 former law deans are here today. Just Professor McCamus, myself, Harry Arthurs, Patrick Monahan, Lauren Sawson, Mary Condon, and we lost a former law dean just 2 weeks ago, the wonderful Dean Stan Beck, who some of you would know. Category 3, many Osgoode professors that I've known well and for a long time. Category 4, many new law professors that I haven't met before. And they have published wonderful articles and delivered wonderful speeches. I went to a lecture by the Osgoode, sponsored by the Osgoode Society for Legal History about a month ago, and it was revisiting the Persons case, the famous Persons case from around 1930. And there were 3 speakers. One was Justice Sharp, who had written a book on that topic, but the other 2 were Osgoode names. I recognized the names, but I had never met them. Professor Patricia McMahon and Professor Lawrence. And they were both incredible. They were just so interesting and so articulate and so knowledgeable about that case. And so it was a pleasure to meet for about 10 seconds this morning, Professor Lawrence. And then the final category, my Osgoode students. Some of them, there aren't a lot here today, but my Chief Justice is here. My best ever constitutional law student, Lawrence Sawson, is sitting right there. So it's good to be here amongst an Osgoode group to celebrate Peter Hogg. I was Dean of Osgoode in its 100th year. It was a wonderful school led by, when I was there in that 100th year, led by what all of the law deans would say was, we thought, the best president in Canadian education. It's President Arthurs, former Dean Arthurs, who led the school. And it just was a wonderful time to celebrate Osgoode's 100th anniversary under his leadership of the whole university. That's 100 years ago. It's now 135 years old, and it is still a magnificent law school. So let me reminisce for a few minutes about my colleague and good friend, Peter Hogg. I met Peter at the University of Victoria, where I was a teacher. I was a graduate at Dalhousie Law School. I went to Cambridge to do, I loved constitutional law. It was by far my favorite subject in law school in the 1970s in Dalhousie. You might ask why that would be the case. There was no charter. Most of the cases dealt with who had jurisdiction, federal or provincial, over things like grain and apples, and endless cases on who had jurisdiction over things like that. But I fell in love with it and went off to Cambridge to do a master's degree under the supervision of Professor David Williams. I haven't met her yet, but there's a Cambridge professor here today, Alison Young. If she's here, could she put up her hand? Ah, good. I look forward to meeting you. David Williams was my supervisor. So I'm glad, I didn't know they had a chair named after him, but boy, did he deserve it. A really wonderful man. I then took my first job at the University of Victoria Law School and taught constitutional law. And 1 or 2 years later, Peter Hogg arrived out at the University of Victoria as a visiting professor. He took a sabbatical and he came for 6 months, 1 term. And he was given the office next to me. And that's how I met him. Let me tell you the best thing about Peter's visiting term at the University of Victoria. There were 2 sections of first-year constitutional law. I taught one of the sections. The best thing about Peter's visit was that he did not teach the other section. 10 years later, when I became Dean of Osgoode, I read the course evaluations, and his evaluations, the first time I read them, were astonishing. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. And I'll say more about that in a few moments. But that's where I met him. He came and did not teach. And I therefore didn't have to get compared at age 27 with Peter Hogg as a classroom teacher. What was Peter like in 1978? He was friendly. It might be 1979. I just am not entirely sure about that. It's one or the other. What was Peter like in 1978? He was friendly, relaxed, unpretentious, modest, a listener more than a talker. He was a serious scholar. He was finishing writing the first edition of that magnificent constitutional law textbook. And most of us would have the current version, which is about that wide. The first version was a giant book. It was really quite incredible that he could write 600 or 700 pages about Canadian constitutional law when no one else had ever done it. So it was quite an impressive book. And that's what he was working on. That's why he was in Victoria. He just wanted to be in a quiet place and write that book. We had adjoining offices. We became good friends. His wife, Fran, and my wife, Gladys, became very good friends. It was just a great 6 months. He treated me as an equal. We were not equal in the constitutional law domain. We were far from equal. Peter gave me great advice about classroom teaching, and I will give it all to you. Be organized. 2 words, be organized. Classroom teaching. Peter also gave me great advice in, I think, my 2nd year of trying to be a scholar about how to be a scholar and about legal writing. And his answer on that was, his advice on that was much longer. It was be organized and write. And that's what he did. Every single day in that office next to mine, he was writing that book. And he just was the most organized and the most productive person you could imagine. Also, just the most modest. He just was enjoying what he was doing. I was 27 years old at the time, or maybe 28. And that simple advice has stayed with me almost 50 years in every job I have had. And I've tried hard to be faithful to it. Be organized and write. And I'm in a job now where both of those are fair, especially the last one is quite important. So he gave me good advice. Peter gave me the draft chapters of his book as he was writing them. My overwhelming reaction to what I was reading was its remarkable clarity of thought and of writing. I can say today that almost 50 years after Peter's textbook was first published, virtually every law student who has read the book, in other words, every Canadian law student probably, because constitutional law is a compulsory course in every law school in the country, would probably say the same thing. One word about Peter Hogg: clarity of both thought and especially writing. By the end of Peter's visiting year at the University of Victoria, my wife Gladys and I were close friends with Peter and Fran Hogg. That friendship lasted more than 40 years. In 1979-80, I came to Osgoode Hall Law School as a visiting professor. The other great constitutional law scholar, Walter Tarnopolsky, at Osgoode at the time. Can you imagine Tarnopolsky and Hogg on the same faculty? Walter was going on a sabbatical, and the then dean, I suspect prodded by Peter himself, who had been with me a year before, Stan Beck called me, and he asked if I would like to be a visiting professor. And I said yes, and I inherited everything of Walter's for the whole year. his secretary, his research assistant, his giant corner office, which was incredible at the time, and his courses, first year constitutional law and civil liberties. For Gladys and myself, it was an incredible experience. Neither of us had ever set foot in Toronto, ever. We were both from villages in Nova Scotia, and we came to Toronto, and I fell in love with Toronto and with the Osgoode Hall Law School. It was such a dynamic place. It was very different from small Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. And the faculty with the range of constitutional and public law scholars was very different than the small University of Victoria Law faculty. So it was just a great year. And faculty members, a small number of them, were very welcoming to us. I wrote down here last week 6 names: John and Pat Evans, Louise Arbour and Larry Tamman, Peter and Fran Hogg. All 3 of those couples invited us into their world for the whole year I was there. And all of them remained good friends for the rest of our lives. Peter, I was trying to do some writing on that year, and I did. Peter reviewed and helped me with my scholarly writing. His message was the same as what he had said at the University of Victoria. Be organized, Jim, and write while you're here. And I tried to do that. I became Dean of Osgoode Hall Law School in 1987, and I digress here. But everybody in this room, when you think of your lives, could think of the occasion where you gave the best advice to someone ever. How many of you thought of the occasion in your long lives where you gave the worst advice ever? I'm digressing to tell you the worst advice I ever gave, and it was to Louise Arbour. See you there. When I became dean, Louise was the associate dean. And by the way, parenthetically, I would say, if she had wanted to apply to be dean of Osgoode, I wouldn't have applied, that's for sure. But she didn't want it, but she was associate dean and agreed to stay on as associate dean. About 1 week, 2 at the most, into our time working together in the dean's office, she came in, closed the door, sat down, and said, Jim, I need your advice. I need to tell you something, but I would be interested in what you say. And I said, of course. And she was being very serious. She said, I've just had a call from the Minister of Justice, and he has offered me an appointment on the Superior Court. And I have to think about it pretty quickly and give an answer. What do you think? Well, I can remember thinking very carefully and then giving her this advice. I don't think you should take it. You're a wonderful teacher. You're a wonderful scholar. You like this place. You're good as associate dean. I look forward to working with you for these 5 years. And Louise, I know you well enough to say this and know that you'll think it's genuine. I just think if you go to that job, that's your job for the rest of your life, Superior Court judge. And I just think you have the talent and the personality to have a really interesting career if you decline this job. And I remember saying at the end, I said, I think you could do this. I think you could do that. So I don't know why I say this, Louise, but I see you someday as the president of York University. Well, we all know what job she did get after being a judge. So that's the worst advice I've ever given to anyone in my life. Don't take the judicial appointment. I became Peter's colleague again when I became dean. By 1988, it was obvious he was by far the best constitutional law scholar in Canada. His textbook by 1988 was legendary, as it still is. Plus, he was a highly respected constitutional advisor, especially to the federal government, but also to many other governments and to some private clients as well. And now I come to teaching. As dean, I had to read the course evaluations, and I actually took that seriously. At some point in late June, I would get all the course evaluations and read them. And Peter's were really quite incredible. There was a chart that students would just circle numbers from 1 to 5, and 1 was perfect and 5 was awful. And Peter taught constitutional law, 60 students, tax, 100 students, and trust, 100 students. Year after year after year, I saw entire classes with circle nothing but number 1s. 60, 100, 100, every question, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. all of them. And I'm honestly not making this up. That's what his course evaluation said. So teachers loved him for all those years. The other person who got hundreds almost every time was Neil Brooks in tax. So I remember once just sitting there in my chair at Osgoode, the dean's chair, thinking, how many deans in this country can say that they have 2 sections of tax where 200 students are totally happy? And they were. They were just 2 great teachers. So his teaching was, there was no one even close in evaluations to Peter Hogg as a teacher. No one even close. And then you think of what words I could use to describe Peter as a constitutional scholar. Same words. No one even close as a constitutional scholar, probably in the history of Canadian legal education. So, and one final word. As a dean, you're watching the hallways, you're watching the classrooms, your ears to the ground. Peter and his students, he was really respected and loved outside the classroom at all. And that's because he was accessible, he was friendly, he was courteous. Importantly, he was unhurried. If a student stopped him, he stopped and he would listen, and then he'd think, and then he'd talk to the student. And I saw that over and over again in the cafeteria and in the hallways in the years I was dean. He was just remarkable with students. Margaret Atwood once said this about her teachers at Queen's University, quote, learning, particularly in a university, involves a kind of laying on of minds. What you learn from your teachers is not merely a body of knowledge, but a way of thinking, and beyond that, a way of being in the world. This is a perfect description of the relationship between Peter and his students at Osgoode Hall Law School. After I left Osgoode for the bench, ignoring my own advice a few years earlier to Louise, I was young too and said yes. Peter and I stayed in close touch. He did not change. For 25 more years, he was Canada's preeminent constitutional law scholar, and I am certain the best teacher at Osgoode Hall Law School for all of those years, I think. He even became dean, an interesting choice for him. I wouldn't have thought he would do that, but he did it, and he did it wonderfully well. So today, in the company of many Osgoode people, I celebrate Peter Hogg, a wonderful person, central to the 135-year history of Osgoode Hall Law School, and central to the history of Canadian constitutional law. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and it's challenging to follow these distinguished speakers and really to echo what they have said and what I think we will hear over the course of today. And I do have a PowerPoint set of slides, and I don't know if anyone can see it because I can't see it, but you'll see that I actually have a little bit of a theme here, but I have 2 real purposes in speaking with you this morning. First, of course, to honor and to recognize Peter, and in particular to speak a little bit about the important role that he played for me personally as a professor at Osgoode, a colleague and a friend over many years. But secondly, to try to articulate the proposition that I put before you, and it's in this title slide, the most influential Canadian lawyer of the past half century, and to try to, if any of you need persuading, and I suspect there will not be very many of you here, to put that case to you and try to articulate and to put meat on that argument. So let me turn then to my first purpose, which is to speak a little bit about my own personal contact, my own personal relationship with Peter and the influence he had on me. I was fortunate enough, and Chief Justice Tulloch talked earlier about how he was in Section E in, I guess it would have been 1983 or 1986 when you started at Osgoode. I was assigned to Section C in 1977. I think there were some others here. I think Michael Barrick, who's here, was also in that class, as was Andromache Karakatsanis, who's also here and will be speaking later today. If you had said there was going to be someone on the Supreme Court of Canada, on the Court of Appeal, and be the managing partner of a major Toronto law firm, all in Section C that year, you would have been a bit surprised, but because we were just a bunch of green law students. But we happened to draw the winning lottery ticket, which was to have Professor Peter Hogg as our professor of constitutional law. And I've put up here this photo because this was the first edition of Constitutional Law of Canada. It was a red book. You'll see it's a bit dog-eared there. It was Peter's had just published Constitutional Law of Canada, and that was our assigned textbook. And I'm going to say a bit more about that book in a few moments. But I can tell you that sitting in that class that year and being part of that class was for me a profound and life-changing experience. It gave me, in fact, a dream. The dream was to come back to Osgoode, to be a faculty member at Osgoode, and to be a colleague of Peter Hogg, and to teach constitutional law. Unlike Jim, I wanted to teach constitutional law, not to compare myself to Peter, but to learn from Peter. And that dream, in fact, came true a couple of years later. In fact, got appointed to Osgoode, and I can tell you it was beyond my wildest dream. You see a lottery, there are ads that are run for lotteries, and they say, well, what's your dream? And they ask someone, what's your dream if you win the lottery? And there's some house, car, something showing. And they say, no, that you got to really dream big. You got to exceed your dreams. And that's what I actually came true for me, being part of Osgoode and being part of a colleague of Peter's. And there are many things that I could talk about at Peter as a colleague and as a friend, but I just wanted to share, and I see Ian Green is here, Ian Green from York. And as a sign of how great a colleague Peter was, every couple of weeks, he would convene a Friday lunch. And at that Friday lunch, anyone was invited to attend from the faculty, but not only from the law school, but from other faculties at York. And Ian, as I recall, was a regular attendee, I think was as Donald Smiley and a number of other colleagues from the political science department. And what we all looked forward to these lunches, because at those lunches, Peter would just talk and we would have a discussion about some recent cases. There was no real agenda, but we all looked forward to that. And that was a sign of that collegiality. It was a unique sort of experience and it was because of Peter's willingness to share and to be a part of that experience. Now, I will tell you, when I started teaching, Peter was appointed as my faculty visitor. It was called a faculty visitor. And the role of the faculty visitor was to come to your classes, sit in on your classes, and then take some notes and come and you'd meet afterwards. And I remember when I was teaching, and Peter would be at the back of the room, you'd come regularly. And I would think to myself, what did he do that was so good, that made him such a great professor? I was trying to remember, and I thought, I don't remember. I honestly don't remember. I sat through that class and I would try to remember what made him so good, but I could never figure it out. Even though Peter would talk to me, I think I have figured it out now. I'm going to come to that a little bit later. But notwithstanding that, I did not get all ones in my student evaluations. That were much more toward the other end of the spectrum.
I can confirm that.
Yeah. Notwithstanding Peter's assiduous efforts, but he was extremely patient. He was extremely generous, always very positive. Oh, that went very well. That class went very well. He and I both knew it actually hadn't gone all that well, but he was very patient. And in fact, he was so generous, as was mentioned, I had an opportunity to work with him on one of his books. And also, in fact, we co-taught a course years later as part of the Osgoode Professional Development Program. And I can say that Peter, for me, had a unique and so special and meaningful role that guided me and caused me to make some decisions and choices and to try to do things. So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to speak about him here today. People have talked about already influence. And in talking about influence, I distinguish here influence versus fame. Influence is the power to cause an effect or change without exertion of force or command. We can distinguish that from fame, which is being known or talked about by many people. Now, you can guess which one of these two individuals was the influencer and which is the person with fame. I'll leave that to you to figure out, but Peter was not famous. Peter was known in legal circles, but if you went on the street and asked 100 people, who is Peter Hogg? I suspect you would have had blank stares. But Peter was influential. Peter was influential in shaping law, in shaping our understanding in many ways, not comparable to Albert Einstein. I won't go that far. That would be a bit hyperbole, but I think in a way that no other lawyer did over the last half century. When you talk about Peter's influence, you have to start with constitutional law of Canada. And when we started when Andromache, Michael, and I and the rest of our Section C started in September of 1977, Peter explained to us how this book had come about. And what he had said was that when he started at Osgoode in 1970, the dean at that time, Jerry Ledane, had come to him and said, you know, constitutional law isn't really a very popular subject with the faculty. I can't get enough people to teach it. Would you be willing to take on a section of constitutional law? I know it's a very dry topic, but I'd like you to take it on. And Peter, of course, having arrived from New Zealand, said, I don't know anything about constitutional law. How can I be qualified to teach it? Justice Dean Ledane said, look, I need someone to teach the course. That's not an excuse that you don't know anything about the subject. So Peter said, well, since I'm going to be here in Canada, I may as well learn something about the Constitution. It's a bit different here, so I'll take it on. Okay. And so what Peter did was he started teaching constitutional law, and he talked to me about this later. He said, you know, I was surprised. There were no textbooks, no current textbooks on constitutional law. There was a leading case book, and I see with John Laskin here with us today. John's father, Bora, of course, had the leading case book. There were number of case books on constitutional law, but there was no textbook. And Peter found this curious, because how are you supposed to explain to the students what the principles are in an area of law? So what Peter started to do, as he explained, was he would write up notes on different areas of law, summarizing those areas of law. And he typed those notes up. Peter wrote by hand, of course, didn't have a typewriter, or he didn't have later would have a computer, but he had those notes typed up, and he would hand them out to the students, give them to students in class. And he would do this each year to add a few more notes. And after he'd been doing this for 5 or 6 years, he had this collection of notes. He thought, well, I think maybe I've got a bit of a book here. And he went to Carswell, and Carswell said, no, would you publish this as a book? And they said, actually, yes, we would publish as a book. And if you go back to that earlier slide, which I won't do now, but you'll notice it was a student edition. This is a book for students. I mean, it's not a serious constitutional law book. This is the book of notes, so students can follow along and understand the course. And so that was the genesis of the constitutional law of Canada. Now, almost immediately, however, the book was recognized as an authoritative and leading text in constitutional law. In fact, Donald Smiley, who was not unbiased because he'd been attending these Friday lunches, wrote a book review the next year, and he said, in a prescient way, this constitutional law text by Peter Hogg is going to be the most widely used reference on the Canadian Constitution for years to come, not only by lawyers, but by political scientists. And I'm going to try to explain as well why I think that was. But I'll get to that in a minute. But what was immediately apparent was that Donald Smiley was right, because the Supreme Court of Canada, 1979, cited the Constitutional Law of Canada. And you'll see here that that book has continued to be cited by the Supreme Court of Canada. And I know we have Wade Wright with us here today, who's going to be speaking later today, who's now taken on the authorship of Constitutional Law of Canada to continue this book, which is a great book. It's been cited well over 200 times by the Supreme Court of Canada. It's been cited over 1,000 times by lower Canadian courts. It's also been cited by final courts of appeal, the United Kingdom, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel. It's also been cited, though, by many scholars. Over 5,000 references to the book in Google Scholar. So there's got to be something more about this book just than some ordinary textbook. But I'll come back to that in a minute. But then Peter didn't just publish Constitutional Law of Canada. He then published in 1997 an article in the Osgoode Law Journal with Alison Thornton. And I think Alison is here today. She's here right now. She's going to be speaking today. But he published this article on chartered dialogue. And that article was adopted by the Supreme Court of Canada. The argument in charter dialogue was that jurisprudence under the charter and the role of courts under the charter involves a dialogue between the courts and the legislature. So yes, the legislatures pass a law, and the courts might say that law is unconstitutional. But what Peter pointed out, and what Peter and Alison pointed out, was that that wasn't the end of the story. That was merely part of the story. And courts would speak, and then legislatures would come back and modify the law or pass substituting legislation, which would be influenced by and take into account what the Supreme Court of Canada said. And that substitute law might then come to the Supreme Court of Canada. So what Peter argued was that, in fact, judicial review should be seen as this process, this iterative process between legislatures and courts. And that was important to Peter because Peter was very preoccupied with the issue of the legitimacy of judicial review. And that's why the subtitle to the Charter Dialogue article was, maybe the Charter of Rights isn't such a bad idea after all. Now, and I'm going to come back to that later, but you'll see that in Supreme Court of Canada, in the case called Vreend, immediately adopted this. Justice Iacobucci said, well, Charter Dialogue. Justice Peter Hogg, not Justice Peter Hogg, Dean Hogg and Alison Thornton have put forward this article. And we think, Supreme Court of Canada, this is exactly right. It was adopted in Vreend. It's been cited frequently by the Supreme Court of Canada, most recently in the Sullivan case in 2022. And look as well, I think, I would argue that it's had an influence on the evolution of jurisprudence and particularly on remedies, because in the 1990s, as is pointed out here, all 12 Supreme Court of Canada cases in which they had declared legislation to be invalid, all 12 cases, the declaration of validity took immediate effect. But then between 2003 and 2015, they declared 17 statutory provisions unconstitutional. But in 13 of them, they suspended the declaration of invalidity. And they said, we need to give time for the legislatures to respond, to engage in dialogue. So now that's since been, the Supreme Court has since revisited that. I think Justice Karakatsanis, in fact, in a case called Ontario versus G in 2020 said, hey, hold on a minute. Hey, we've gone too far down here. And it's probably right. Certainly it's right until someone else in the Supreme Court of Canada says otherwise. But the point being that Peter Hogg's dialogue theory wasn't just something referred to. It had an effect. It had an impact. It had an influence. Now, of course, Peter didn't just write about constitutional law. He wrote about other areas of law. He had a PhD thesis. Now, how many PhD theses? Now, I don't have a PhD, right? So I wouldn't know. I think there's probably a lot of people in this room who do. How many people's PhD thesis becomes a leading international text? Peter Hogg's was. Peter Hogg, as part of his, got a PhD from Monash University, 1970. And he wrote this text on liability of the crown. He was I asked him once, because I actually then started working with him in this book, like, why did you pick this topic? He said, well, there wasn't much written out about it. No one had written about it. So I thought, I'll give it a try. The same thing as with the constitutional law. So he writes this book, and it's been cited, that book's been cited over 50 times by the Supreme Court of Canada. It's also been cited by courts internationally, which is noted there. There's over 500 references to that in Google Scholar. Must be something more than just an ordinary textbook. But then Peter was teaching tax, and as my colleague Jim says, he was teaching tax. And he was getting ones every year in tax. And he was doing the same thing. He started writing up these notes about tax and handing them out to students. So then, in 1985, he says, oh, maybe I've got a book here. And he had Joanne McGee, who was a tax professor. And I think Joanne maybe is here today. I don't know. I'm not sure. He's going to be here today. And he says, why don't we turn this into a book? So that's published. Well, it immediately becomes an authoritative text. In the next year and a half, every Supreme Court of Canada tax case cited Peter Hogg and McGee, Principles of Income Tax Law, because it had this primary reference, became this source book. So let me try to summarize why I think Peter's writing is so influential. People have already spoken a little bit about this. First, clarity. It was a unique ability to synthesize an area of law and to make it understandable and comprehensible. In fact, when he set out the law and described the jurisprudence, might be very complicated, conflicting decisions, Peter would bring forward a coherent explanation of what these cases actually stood for. And when he did that, he would immediately say, you know, he's right. That seems absolutely right. It seems obvious now, but it wasn't obvious before Peter Hogg said it. But that wasn't just in itself the reason why Hogg's, I don't think, was so influential. It's the second point. The Hogg book and the Hogg writing wasn't just descriptive. It proceeded from first principles. There was a central organizing theme to all of his work. What was the central organizing theme of constitutional law of Canada? I think it was simply this. It was a theme of caution and of judicial restraint. Peter Hogg was very concerned about the anti-democratic implications of judicial review. And so Peter's counsel to courts was to be cautious, to stay within your area of expertise, and to leave policymaking to Parliament as much as possible. It didn't mean that courts would never intervene. Courts should intervene, but they should do so in areas of recognized expertise. And so Peter, along, I think, with Harry Arthurs, Harry Glasbeek, and many others at Osgoode in the early 1980s, was very concerned about the enactment of the charter. In fact, Peter initially was somewhat of a charter skeptic. He thought, is this really a good idea to hand over to the courts all of this power to review legislation? I think it's a problem. I think it's a real problem. And that's reflected in his 1985 book, Constitutional Law of Canada, where he's cautioning, be careful, courts, don't take these charter rights too far. But as the charter evolved, that's why Peter, in his 1997 dialogue article, the subtitle of which was maybe the Charter of Rights isn't such a bad thing after all. Because Peter, as time went on, said, you know, maybe this actually makes sense to have the courts and legislatures doing this. And he actually, I think, became much more positive about the Charter. But nevertheless, constitutional law of Canada, the central organizing theme of that book, I think Wade will agree, is one of a caution of judicial restraint. And everything is judged by that, which becomes to my third point. It's a normative theory. His books are not just descriptive, they're normative. They say the Supreme Court was wrong to do this, right? He's not shy about saying when the Supreme Court is wrong. Unlike, of course, many counselors, he would appear in court who are afraid often to say the courts are wrong. Peter Hogg wasn't afraid. He would say, because this doesn't accord with first principles. Liability of the Crown was also based on first principles. The liability of the Crown book, the first principle there was that the Crown should be treated to the greatest extent possible as any other litigant in the courts. And that became the central organizing principle of the liability of the Crown. Now, described here as Peter as the lawyer's lawyer, he appeared frequently as counsel in the Supreme Court of Canada. And interestingly enough, he was often retained by the Attorney General of Canada. He wasn't just retained by private litigants. The Attorney General said, got an important case called Hogg. And Hogg would come and would argue in front of the Supreme Court of Canada. And Ian Binney, who was on the court and who would be interacting with then Dean Hogg, would describe Hogg's advocacy as Hogg relishing facing down 9 interrogators, like a chess master, simultaneously playing 9 opponents and defeating them all. And in fact, sometimes we talked about people changing their minds. Sometimes Peter would come forward and make an argument that was inconsistent with what he had said in constitutional law of Canada. Well, Professor Hogg, on page 1452 in footnote 25, you said something different. And Hogg would rightly say, yes, I was wrong. I'm going to be revising that in my next edition. Well, I see I'm running short of time. I'm not going to, I've talked here about advisor to prime ministers. He advised the Governor General in 2008 on the prohibition crisis. He also was at Meech Lake, and he supervised, I say that, the hearings for prospective SCC judges before parliamentary committees, and he really did supervise. And he was described, Brad Berg, who's here at the back of the room, described Peter at Blake's as a Renaissance man, because he wasn't just involved in constitutional public law, he was involved in corporate, he was involved in tax, securities. He was a resource in all areas of law. He was beloved by his students, and I later came to believe that his it was something I think mentioned by Chief Justice Tulloch. It's summarized in the word RESPECT, respect. He treated the students with respect, and they felt it, and he treated them as colleagues, and he led them with him jointly in a learning experience. He was generous. If you look at a conference program, in the biographies, Peter Hogg was always the shortest. It was a simple one line. Peter Hogg teaches law at the Osgoode Law School and writes in constitutional cases. That's it. One line. Records that will never be broken. Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? our nation turns its lonely eyes to you. Well, there are records that will never be broken. Joe DiMaggio hit in 56 straight games in 1940, over 2 months. That record will may be broken, but hasn't been broken in 82 years. Peter Hogg, his influence, the range of areas that he had influence, his influence as a scholar, his influence as a teacher, his influence as an advisor is unparalleled. And I don't think will ever be paralleled. As we are coming in, and I will conclude here, my chair, I know we're running over time, but as we are coming in today, Michael Barrett said to me, you know, I hope someone mentions today George Orwell's statement that all saints should be judged guilty until they are proven innocent. Well, I submit to you that even if you presume, you begin whatever presumption you begin with, Peter is in fact the most influential lawyer of the past half century. Thank you very much.
A very warm thank you to all three members of our panel. That was a lovely beginning of today's activities. Tied by the time limits, so we're going to adjourn in 2 minutes or so. I wanted to just add a personal reflection or two of my own, and in particular, I wanted to mention Peter's wonderful wife, Fran. The title of this panel is Remembering Peter. It's impossible to remember Peter and not also remember Fran. She was an absolutely wonderful woman and wonderful partner for Peter. She was a very charming, a very intelligent person. She and Peter met at Harvard. Peter had come over from New Zealand to do graduate work at Harvard. Fran was there as a student. They had two lovely children, David and Anne, who are with us here today. And those of us on the faculty enjoyed getting to know the Hogg family over the years very, very much. I've no doubt that Peter's relationship with Fran and his rich and fulfilling family life was the central importance to him. Indeed, during Peter's time as dean, Fran insisted on entertaining, this seems impossible, insisted on entertaining every member of the faculty. So we all got to go to the Hogg household and have a wonderful meal with Peter and Fran and the kids, and many happy memories were generated. Apart from family life, Fran was very active in the community. She was the head of the volunteer section at the Art Gallery of Ontario. She chaired the board of the YWCA, et cetera, et cetera. She was a great contributor to the community around her. She had strong opinions. She was a strong advocate for feminist values and gender reform issues and so on. I have no doubt that Peter was to some extent influenced by Fran in similar views, which he took over time. Fran was, of course, American. Peter was a New Zealander. If you met them and someone told you one's from New Zealand, the other's from the United States, you would have no trouble telling which was which. There was the accent issue, New Zealand versus New England, that made it kind of obvious. But they also represented national stereotypes to some extent. Peter was very reserved, not shy, but reserved in manner. Fran was obviously American, very warm, outgoing, kind of noisy, hilarious person whom one fell in love with immediately. Peter had the same qualities of sense of humor and so on, but masked to a considerable extent by his reserved nature. If I can share with you a melancholy moment at the hospital after Peter's stroke, I was there visiting. Anne was there at the same time. Peter was unable to communicate, but he obviously became very agitated about something, moving his limbs, kind of pointing towards the window, perhaps, but unable to explain what was bothering him. And finally figured it out. Over on the windowsill was a portrait of Anne. Sorry, a portrait of Fran. Anne went over, grabbed the portrait, took it and put it on Peter's bedside table, and he calmed it right down. They were obviously very devoted to each other, and we were very devoted to them. I think I'm out of time, and it's time for our break. Thank you so much for attending this session.